Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and today I'm very excited to bring to you the second in sort of a series of analytics coming out of CTC. The first one, we went through an introduction to sort of like what is the analytics that we offer, and today we're going to go way deeper and dig extraordinarily into like how do we actually navigate these analytics here. So, of course, as always, by the way, our webinars are recorded. This will be posted to our YouTube channel shortly after this particular webinar. And we encourage you to certainly subscribe to that webinar, to that YouTube channel, ctcsoftware.com. You can get to the YouTube channel that way real easy and subscribe there, because this is probably something, if you're interested in analytics, if you're interested in the web APIs, if you're interested in Power BI and dashboards and showing reports, then you're probably going to refer back to this particular webinar periodically. And so that YouTube channel is definitely going to be an asset, I think, for you. Also, as always, of course, we're watching the questions window while we're going through the content today. So when you have questions, I encourage you to throw the questions into there. And also, I always save a large QA session at the end. And I think especially today, we'll have a lot of room for questions and answers near the end of this one. So what are we going to talk about? Well, many of you have been asking for easier access to the data that HIVE, the CMS stores, HIVE, the project activity logger stores, your user and group information, your general CTC licensing, availability, and usage information. All of that is effectively now available via the CTC Reporting API. So the HIVE and the general CTC analytics is all there. We're going to take a look at a couple of different ways today that you can leverage this at your own firm to effectively build whatever reporting it is you need. Everybody's needs are different. I can give you some default dashboarding on our webpage to give you some core essential information, but you're probably going to want to customize that. And so we're going to take a look at how you can do whatever it is you need, tying it to any system you want, whether that be Microsoft Power BI, whether it be leveraging it in SQL Server in your own internal databases for your own workflows, whether it be Domo, whether it be, I don't know, you name it, Crystal Reports. You can use this information anywhere you'd like, very easily. Well, fairly easily, assuming you're into data and you have a little bit of programming knowledge, because it will take some knowledge to do some of this work. So we're going to take a look at this. How do you harvest the data? How do you store it? We're going to get sort of into the storage side a little bit today, but really, I want to make sure that I'm answering as many of your questions as I possibly can today so that you can begin leveraging this. And certainly if you have questions in the future, we encourage you to reach out. All right, so we're talking about a couple core pieces of information here. We're going to take a look at the essential, like basic web API connectivity that exists within the CTC web API. We're going to talk about them a little bit in general, but we're also going to talk about it very much in detail to how CTC leverages this. We're going to do some really lightweight linking of this web API data directly into Microsoft Power BI, because very specifically, you all can get access to that for free. And so I want to start with a free tool that you can begin to leverage. Now, Microsoft Power BI is absolutely not the best data storage utility, but we're going to start there because it's a good entry-level tool that has zero cost for an entry level. We're also going to take a look at something called recursive data mining, and I'm going to explain what that means and how to do it. And we're going to actually work through that a little bit, and I'll talk through some sample code that you'll have access to that you can leverage to recursively go through and pull data out of the system, and I'll explain why it's necessary as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about a process in the data science world called ETL, or extracting, translating, and loading data from a web API into a local database. Now, we're going to talk about that more than show it, but I will kind of demonstrate a bit about how this process can work. And again, there's sample code available so that you can actually try this for yourself in whatever system it is you want to work with. First of all, we're going to start lightweight. We're going to start as lightweight as we possibly can. We're going to talk about some of the essential things that you need to connect to data. Now, I've been looking through the names on the webinar, the attendees list today, and I know some of you already have your connection information available to you. If you don't, I'm going to show you how you can reach out to get some connection information that you will need to be able to do these steps yourself. But everything that you can get, or that I'm going to talk about today, is effectively free. So you just have to ask for it or go get it, go download it, and you can get all the stuff. I like giving stuff away for free whenever I possibly can, because then the value of what it does for you is all up to you at that point. So first of all, let's talk about how to access this data and what the necessary tools are. To access the web API in general, any web API, you typically will need some kind of a reporting key, some kind of access code. Now, that's not always true. For example, Yahoo Finance or Google Finance, they have a web API, and a lot of that information is just public domain, public knowledge, publicly available. There's no key needed for that. In your case, since this is your data, this is your Revit content, this is your project usage, it's your licensing usage, you want that a bit protected. So for you to be able to get access to your data, you need to reach out and request your specific reporting key. And you do that by emailing licenserequest@ctcsoftware.com and just let them know that you want to dig into the web API and that you need a reporting key. And your reporting key will be emailed back to you. It's going to be a GUID, just like Revit's shared parameter GUID. It's a GUID. You can go ahead and just get that. It's free again. You just get it by using CTC software, but we want to know who's leveraging it. So reach out and ask, and we'll send one over. You also need to know how to connect to the web API and where your reporting key will go. And this is going to be the starting point for pretty much everything that you're going to do with the web API. And so the web address that you're going to be leveraging, it's a little bit long here. This is a great time to do like a screenshot, though I'm going to be giving you some stuff that's going to be automatically building this for you as well. But in case you wanted to go take a look at some of this, I put a sort of a sample company's reporting key up here that has very little data in it. So it's super lightweight, but it's the API at ctcsoftware.com. We're specifically, in this case, looking at the accounts collection of data, looking at the reports returned data for groups. So accounts groups specifically is what we're looking for here. With a reports key, this is kind of the critical part. You'll see this in pretty much every query you send. It's going to send along a reports key, and this long GUID right here is the reporting key that you'll be asking for. Of course, this is for a different company. So if I was to follow this link right now, I'm going to go ahead and click on this and follow it. This is what shows up, right? It's data that streams back to you. It gives you a bunch of information, and you're like, Sean, that doesn't look very useful at all. I get it. Just wait. We're going to get into this way, way deeper so that we could leverage this. And in fact, just so that, if you all wanted to kind of follow along with me, I'm going to go ahead and throw this into the chat just in case you were like, I really want to click on that link and I want to see exactly what that looks like. I'm going to just throw this in here. And I'll be throwing a couple of links into the chat. So those of you who are participating live in the live webinar and able to ask questions, you'll be able to actually click these links directly. And maybe they'll make it into the YouTube description too. I don't know. All right. So I just clicked on this link right here for accessing the data. And by the way, in case you don't like typing, I clicked instead of copying. Can I go back? Back, please. Can I copy this? No, I can't. I'll copy that later on, or it's pretty easy. It's license request, and you've already got the rest of our extension here. So let's continue forward here. We're going to take a look as well at, I think my slide's a little screwy here. Yep, it's got the wrong order. Give me 1 second here. I just want this to be in the correct order so it shows up right for you. There we go. Next slide. I want to give you access to all of the files that I'll be working with today. And so I have set up a little GitHub repository that's got every single file, every bit of code that I've written so far myself today. I'll give a little caveat to this, but I want you to be able to fork this GitHub repository for yourself. Now, you will have to have a GitHub account, But that way you can get all these files, and I can continually update these files, and you can continue to go back there and see when there's been updates. And so this is the repository here. Once again, if I click on this to follow it, it takes me right to the GitHub. I'm signed in as a different account right now, my CTC account. Once again, I will throw this into the chat, GitHub link. Oops. There you go. And so you can simply, once you have a GitHub account, you'll be able to fork this repository and get exactly the same copy of code and all the baseline stuff that I'll be working with today. And you will want that, I'm pretty sure, because you're going to be leveraging a lot of the content inside of here as you go through and leverage this API. This will include some Power BI files that I'll be showing off today. It's going to include some Postman settings, a number of things. Okay, so let's take a look at how we actually navigate through the code that I posted on screen a moment ago, or not, rather the returned data here that we took a look at a moment ago. To do this in a much more clean way, to investigate what's available, you're probably going to want to use a tool other than just your web browser, because the web browser formats this like trash. And so what you want to do is leverage a little tool here called Postman. It's free. Again, you can use this for free. Now, there's certainly paid tiers of a lot of these things I'll be talking about today, but you can absolutely use everything for free. I have paid nothing for any of this stuff because I don't need to, because leveraging this at a core level is free. Postman.com. That's one I'm not going to paste in the chat because that's really easy to type. Go make yourself an account. Sign up for that, and then you'll be able to leverage some of the Postman files that are available in my GitHub repository. In fact, the GitHub right here, there is a folder that's called API Essentials. This folder right here has both a Power BI file as well as a Postman setup collection of stuff where you can create your own environment and get the 4 collections that I leverage regularly. So you can work with all of this data, which I'm going to be using today. So let's take a look at navigating through the Web API, kind of just in general. We're going to dig into Postman here in a minute, but I want to explain like what comes back from a Web API so you know what to expect. Whenever you're using a Web API, whether that be Yahoo Finance or Google Analytics, or in this case, CTC's Web API for reporting, all the time, the data is pretty much going to come back very consistently as a JSON data stream. A JSON data stream is just a whole collection of headers and subheaders of data. That's really all that it is. Think of it like rows and columns in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's laid out item by item. So row by row, we'll call out what its header is and what the data is for that header. And then the next row, what its next piece of data is and what its value is. And so each individual row will have all that data repeated over and over again. So the best way to navigate this information, really, in my opinion, to start is by using the tool Postman that I mentioned a moment ago, because it's going to let you look at it. What am I expecting to get back? How is the data structured? What properties are available for things? What can I expect to see so I know how to structure my resulting data set later? You're going to want to be able to use this again for navigating that data structure and also to see how that particular web API is paginating information. Basically, for a web API to work efficiently, instead of just dumping gigs of data on you, if that's what you're asking for, it tends to stream it to you one page at a time with X number of rows per page. And different web APIs have different capabilities, but the typical maximum is typically 1,000 rows of data from a particular set. And then if there's additional pages, you have to know how to go through and do what's called a recursive data fetch to go get the additional pages. And we'll be talking a bit about how that process works and some general theory that you can use. And again, all of my sample code does all of this for you already. So that you can see more data in a more realistic way, I'm going to take you through a little bit of a Postman introduction. And we're going to start by establishing our workspace so you can see the exact steps for importing the environments and settings that I'll be using. And then I'll take you through some basic navigation, And then we're going to dig into effectively like how do we leverage this data so that we can really plan out how we're going to do our connection in whatever our data set happens to be. All right. So I'm going to jump over here into Postman, and I'm going to start kind of from scratch. I mean, I've got an account and I've already got my environment already set up, but what I want to do is walk you through how you can set an environment up and show you how easy it is. So to do this, I'm going to create a new workspace for myself. When you first make a Postman account, you will already have a workspace. It'll be one default one called My Workspace. Now, if you've already got a Postman environment and you've got other workspaces set up, you're going to probably want to create a workspace for yourself as well and call it something like CTC Reporting API, so you can keep yourself organized up here. You might give yourself a bit of a summary so you know what this is kind of intended for, and maybe you make it personal for yourself. Or maybe you want to make this available to your team in-house or whatever. Totally up to you. But I'm just going to go ahead and create for myself a little personal workspace here. And I will be able to begin leveraging this so that I can have an environment which has some essential variables that I can use. I'll show you how to create that, and also my data collections over here. Now, you can always create your own collections if you have some documentation about a web API, but usually you can either subscribe to somebody's web API workspace, or you can build up your own and kind of get their environments from them. And the easiest way to do this for both collections and environments is to use the import function. So I have my API Essentials folder over here from my code collection from that Reporting API GitHub repository, and I got it downloaded to my local computer. I was using GitHub Desktop as a tool so I can continually maintain this and continually publish this. But what I'm going to do is take in this Postman setup folder, and there's, by the way, instructions here to tell you exactly how to do this, but really all you need to do is grab all of these collections and simply drag and drop them right here. And it puts the 5 files in there, so it has the CTC API environment, and then it has the 4 collections that we're going to need for account reporting, the HIVE CMS reporting, HIVE PAL reporting, and also the general CTC Cloud Shared Licensing reporting. And so all you're going to do is click Import, and it's going to fill them out. It's going to import those, so you'll have an API environment setting here, and you'll have some collections sitting up here. You will want to make a slight modification to the environments here. If you recall, I was telling you about a reporting key that you need to go request. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste my reporting key for the CTC Express Tools account, the one that I typically use for demos. All the HIVE demos that I've done before, all of our web demos that we do at all in our webinars, all of that leverages this same API key. Now, you could certainly try and copy this if you really wanted to, but it doesn't really do you a lot of good because it's not your data and it won't mean anything to you. But I'm going to go ahead and save this. So I'm saving my environment over here. And I put that into the current value, by the way. That's the value that Postman's going to actually use, is this current value over here. I'm also using the CTC General API prefix right here. This is the main portion of that site that you're going to navigate to. And then I have different collections of data here. If I expand out, say, the accounts, reports, user groups right here. The user groups leverages that CTC API.ctcsoftware.com, and then it knows where to go specifically in this case for groups. It's going to sub in the proper reports key right here. Once I have that ready to go, and then it also will understand some of the other options that exist that relate to groups, like what page am I asking for? How big is that page going to be? Do I want to include roles or members? And in fact, because of how this environment or these collections have been set up, you can actually turn off certain things you don't care about, and it'll automatically update whatever that URL happens to be here in Postman. Now, for this to work, for this reports key to fill out right here, it needs to know which environment you're pulling from. So you have to go up here in Postman. Pretty much every time you refresh this page and come back to this, you'll have to make sure you tell Postman, use the CTC API. Now, I do that because every single time you go to any of these different reports, every one of them requires that reports key. And instead of you needing to copy and paste it like 30 times, you simply put it in one spot and make sure during your session you're using the proper environment. The first time I used Postman, this tripped me up a number of times. It messed me up because I kept forgetting to go through the exercise of dropping this down and choosing that. And so the very first time, if you don't do this and you say, send this report, it's going to come back with an error. It couldn't figure out who you are, so it just throws an error. As soon as you set your proper environment here and you send this, it's going to go and request from the web API a bunch of data. So it's going to go to the groups area. It's going to get the first page, first 1,000 records. It's going to include all the role associations, and it's going to include the member associations here and give you all of that data in this little collection of information. And it's kind of in a sort of a pretty format, right? This is something that the general browser can't do. It doesn't know how to make it pretty, but the Postman area here can make it pretty so you can at least view it and see some colorization about what's going on. Now you can see it in raw data if you really want to. That's kind of silly. There's like this preview view, which is basically raw with a different colored background. There's like a visualized thing. I don't know what that does because I've never actually seen that do anything meaningful for me, but pretty is usually how I look at it. This way I can see the JSON data stream coming back. And I can see now that there's a total number of 18 items. This is groups, right? Yeah, this is groups. So I have 18 groups defined in my CTC Express Tools account. For those 18 groups, it has an items collection right here. Every one of our web APIs that is the main collections will do the same exact thing. The first item record right here is a thing. It's a group called BIM managers. It doesn't have a description. It's not associated to the Active Directory system. So there's no domain ID or system ID. It doesn't have a SAML account. This is not hooked up to single sign-on. It was created at a specific date and time. It was created by somebody. That somebody has a GUID identifier for who they are. If I was to go fetch my users, I could match this GUID up with who that was. It also happens to tell me right here who it is. It was me. I made this group. It was updated at a specific time. In fact, it was created and updated at the same, well, I guess it was updated a little later because it was created at whatever that was, 12:30, probably during a web demo. And then it was updated the same day, 2 minutes later with some settings. This is not a default group. It has 2 role assignments to it, whatever 200 and 900 mean. In fact, you can get the role values right here through this request. And then it tells you if there's any members. There's nobody in this group as members, right? So that's the kind of data that you can expect to get back, item by item. If I go to the next one, same thing. There's a whole collection of stuff here. This one here actually happens to have some member IDs associated to it. So I can use this data. I can store this in a way. I can pull this data down using other techniques, and I can store this in a way that's actually useful. Here in Postman, this isn't really useful. Not really. This is just to review what the data structure is and kind of see how things are coming back. Let me give one other example here. I'm going to go into the CMS data. This is the HIVE CMS information. I'm going to go into the reporting section right here, and we're going to go fetch the contents. So this, once again, I'm already in the correct environment here. It remembers that. That's great. It knows my reporting key. It knows I want page 1, 1,000 items. I don't care how it's ordered. That's irrelevant for what I'm doing right now. I don't care if it's descending. Now, there are times when I do care about this, like in my searches environment here, where I want to get the searches by the entire organization. I may want to have it ordered descending and sorted by date. So I'm getting the latest ones first explicitly. And I think searches even has some filters for like when something was searched. So it doesn't return anything after this date. So I could say, give me today's searches or give me yesterday's searches. There's some filtration you can do here so you can get the data set to be a bit smaller potentially. In this case here, though, I'm looking at getting the contents by the org. Again, I'm getting 1,000 at a time. That's the maximum that ours allows, though you could get as few as 1 if you really wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and send this and see what comes back. Okay, so this is going to go fetch all the data. This fetches the records for 6,800 items. 6,836 specifically. So knowing this now in the back of my mind, if I'm getting 1,000 at a time and there's 6,800 rows approximately, that means I would have to go fetch 7 pages worth of data. Okay, we're going to come back to that. That's going to be important later. But in this case, I can also see now how my items are structured. Once again, I'm going to pull this a little taller here. I'm just going to collapse a few of these so we can kind of see like the rest of this doesn't really make a lot of sense right now because this here is an item record. It tells me the Hive item GUID for that particular piece of content, tells me if it has a rating, what its average is. If it's Revit content, it will tell me about its display units, if it's imperial or metric. Tells me what the file extension is, this being a document. It doesn't have any Revit unit data. Tells me what the file name for this happens to be, if it has a custom preview image, if it's located in the cloud or if it's local, what the file name, the actual file name is, or the content name rather, that's stored up there. Sometimes the content name might be different than the file name. That's specifically true for a lot of like Revit project hosted content. Tells me who it's associated to, what organization. In my case, it's me, my organization. Gives me the exact preview URL, or URI rather. This is actually the image that's stored in the Hive cloud. So you can actually pull this down, and in your reports, you could have that image show up in sort of a Power BI report for navigation. I'll show, I don't actually have a good example of that later, but maybe I'll build one up in the future. If it's a Revit category or AutoCAD category, it tells you the ID and name of that category. And a bunch of other stuff. If it's a Revit family, what family type it is or host type, and then who added it, what date, who updated it, and what date. Very little information though, really here. It's just the record that gives you the basics. It's kind of the same things that you would see at the top of the details page in a Hive detailed search, right? It's just the basic information. If you want more about one of these pieces of content, you can get more, but you have to tell it you want more to get the details of the content ID value by ID value, because there's a ton of information that can be embedded inside of here. Let's go down a little ways here and just take a look. If I was to go grab, there's a lot of stuff here. There's some Revit content. There's a bunch of cloud models here, sample models. Let's see, here at the DWG piece of content, I guess we'll just kind of pick one of these here. If I wanted the data about this guy here, this particular ID, if I copy this and I go over to get content by ID, I can go in here and actually post which GUID, which global unique identifier of content I'm looking for. This is actually a required field for you to get extra detail because it goes and fetches this piece of content's extra detail. And I can choose to include all of the file associated, all of the types, all the way down to the parameters and the parameters GUIDs. Like this is everything. What libraries it's associated to, if it's been downloaded by somebody, which project models it's been loaded into by document, name and ID, any reviews that were put on this. I can get every single review, every revision of who's processed updates to this, the tags that are associated, users who have favorited it. All this information is available. So when I send this record, it's going to get a very big piece of data back that tells me everything about that piece of content and every file associated to that piece of content. This particular record in and of itself, just one template, one Revit template model, has 665 rows worth of information associated to it. This is why when you want to get the detailed information about content, you have to go request it content by content. And there's a way to do that. I'm going to show you an example. Again, this will tell me every library it's associated to, every file it's associated to and all of its properties, every revision and who the reviser was, when they made their changes, what category this is associated to. This happens to be a schedule. And because it's a schedule, it might even have multiple files associated to it from multiple version years. In fact, it does. Look at that. So there's a file from my 2022 starter project processed in by probably this user since it's got their username on it, David M. And also the other file here, if I was to expand this out, was processed from the 2019 starter project apparently. Yeah, in Revit version 2019. So it tells me everything about this content and every component and parameter and value and associated piece of information related to this piece of content, right on down again to the GUID if it's got custom parameters associated to it. So a lot of rich data that's here just waiting for you to use and consume if you go fetch it. So we're going to talk about how to do this. Now, this is not a really interesting way to review and look at the data, right? Not interesting or sexy at all. It's just a big, long spread of data. So a better way is to use some kind of analytics style tool, right? And for that, we're going to be talking about bringing this in, at least in an essential way, into Microsoft Power BI. So how do we establish the first connection to Microsoft Power BI? And once again, apparently, I have my order of operations out of whack. Yep, I do. All right, let's get this set up. Give me just a second here. Get this put in here correct. There we go. All right, next slide. So first of all, in case you don't know, how do you get Microsoft Power BI? Well, what you do is you go to powerbi.microsoft.com. That's where you're going to go. And at the very bottom of the page, there is a free download for Microsoft Power BI. So basic page, they want you to start for free. You probably need to have a Microsoft account, which almost every one of us has already. It gives you a bit of an introduction, talks a bit about the tool itself, all kinds of stuff, whatever. Down here near the bottom of the page is download Power BI desktop for free. And you can use it for free. Only thing you got to really pay for is you have to pay if you want to publish these to other team members via like a web portal. That's a paid portion. But if you want to do everything that I'm doing today, it's all 100% free. So once you have downloaded Microsoft Power BI, we're going to go ahead and build a brand new Microsoft Power BI file. And from that, we're going to connect to some web-based data. This is how you can connect to pretty much any web API. If you want to go leverage the data that you pick up today to use with, Google Finance or Yahoo Finance or you name it, you can absolutely do that because all web APIs pretty much work very much the same. The fields you get back are different, but we're going to take a look at building a web API connection, and then we're going to take a little bit of a look at the advanced editor just to kind of see what it's doing. And when you start getting this deep into like really custom report building, you are going to need to get beyond a little bit of just drag and drop. You're going to need to go and actually look at some of the code and be able to rearrange it a little bit so it can become really usable to you. Now, if you're using other tools like Domo or like, Crystal Reports or something else, the workflow here, while it will be a little bit different, the concepts are very much the same. So that's why I'm using Power BI, because the concepts are easier to explain here. And, we can always advance our knowledge in other places by looking at the documentation for that particular tool. So in this case here, I'm in Microsoft Power BI. I've downloaded it. I've got a brand new untitled document, and we have to go fetch some data. In fact, when you first open it up, it's going to ask you to go fetch some data. It's going to ask you to get something from somewhere. And what we want to do when that first dialog pops up here, there we go, is there's all kinds of different data types. There's basically all, which is, you can search through this maybe a little easier, but there's some organized ones as well. There's like file-based data, where you could go after just a JSON file. And we'll take a look at how maybe we could leverage this a little later. But this isn't what you want to use for a web API. You have to get the JSON file first. There's databases of information you can tie into. This is really powerful. We'll talk later on about how to tie into a SQL Server database. There's Power Platforms and other data flows you can talk through. There's Azure-based data, again, with Azure SQL. There's some online services that feed you data. Like you can actually go directly to Google Analytics or Yahoo. I think Yahoo Finance is probably in here someplace as well. I don't know. Maybe it's not. But you can go sometimes directly to those online services and get data a little more cleanly streamed to you. In our case, though, we're going to go to the most raw version of the data using the other information here, and we're going to import data from a web page, direct from a web page. When it gives you a JSON stream back, that's exactly what you want. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that. And there's two ways you can connect to this, either basic connection where you just drop in a URL, or a slightly more advanced way to connect to this where you can actually put in different parts and pieces, very much like how I did it over here in the Postman collection, where I have sort of a base URL, and then there's a portion here that knows which section to go to, and then it's got a reporting key that could be linked up to a parameter or a variable in there, and then some extra fields that you can go after for different things. Eventually, you're going to want to get to that level of getting this a bit more detailed here, but let's just start with this contents by organization. In Postman here, if you go over to the code, what this basically does is it gives you the fully filled out request. exactly what the location is over here. It gives you the entirely filled out everything, so you're not trying to build it up from what you have up here. You can simply copy this. Can't right-click copy? Okay, fine, Control-C. I can highlight it and Control-C that. And then back here in Power BI, if I use the basic setup, I can simply paste this URL and it'll go fetch me some data for my connection. Give this thing a minute because Power BI has to establish that. It has to build a little bit of a query on my behalf. And it pulls me over here into the query editor where it shows me the raw data in more of a spreadsheet-like format. So we can actually step through over here on the far right exactly what it did. It started with a source, which is the JSON.document. It has web.contents and it posts in the path, the exact path with the exact parameters it needs. And it gives you back this information. This information here is very similar to the information that we got back over here, right? Except for it's a little bit rolled up. So it gave me total items 6836. This one's a little bit different for whatever reason. It's giving me the items in list format here, which is effectively everything in the items, which is a list. It's individual items that have sub-records underneath it. And then what Power BI did is it converted this information here, these two rows of data with a list of items, into a table. So it has the column total items here and the items of a list. Now I'm actually going to insert a step in here because I don't really want total items repeated over and over and over and over again. But what they just basically did then is they expanded the items. So they took this list right here and they expanded it. So it gave all of the individual records that were in there. That's basically this here is each individual record. So each of these created a line item in the Power BI space. That's what it does for you. And then what it does is it goes and expands those items. So it gets all their headers and it gives them some default names. And it does a terrible job at automatically naming headers. So I always override this myself. But it basically expands this out. And then it also goes over here to the far right where there's a category column right here. There's a bunch of records inside of here. And it goes, oh yeah, you probably want all those as well. And so it further expands that out to give you the item's category ID and the category name and repeats that data over and over again. And then it does just a little bit of like theoretical automatic cleanup where it tries to go into here and turn certain items into proper numbers here, like the item's average rating. It turns it into an integer value if it detects that there's just integers in those fields all over the place. Some of these it might convert into a date field or something. I don't know, maybe they have dates over here someplace, I'm not sure. Yeah, this turns into a date. So then you can actually do date controls on this in your reporting. But that's the start. It goes in there and gets your data, and now you can begin to leverage this. This only gets the first page of data, and so we have to go a little bit more advanced. We have to figure out how to do the next step, which is recursion. All right, let's jump back to the PowerPoint here for a minute, and let's talk about what that means. Come forward. Thank you. Here we go. What is recursion, really? So first off, it comes from the term recursive, which basically, in the mathematical terms, is a repeatable application of a rule that you can use over and over again to get successive results, right? That's all recursive is. And the act of, doing recursion basically takes a recursive process and runs it. That's all it is. So really, what does this mean? In simple terms, for each page of data, go get me that page. That's what this means. So we have to write that inside of the Power BI environment. We have to tell it to go do that. And this is where you got to get a little bit more advanced. You can't just have Power BI do all the work for you. So far, we could actually just go get all of those individual links and say, go get me it, go get me it. But then I have to find a way to combine stuff together for each of those extra pages of data, unless all you want is 1,000 items, right? So you also have to do recursion, as you saw with the content details or search details. You have to go after each item in a master collection to get each item's detail record and then decide how that's going to get stored. So when that's the case, we have to go back into Power BI And we have to do some things. We may need to create some parameters that we can use to decide how deep of a recursion do we need to go? Which fields do we want to go after? We have to create perhaps some functions for those repeatable recursive steps. We may need to go in there and leverage some master tables in the Power BI environment to improve the speed of the data fetching, because Power BI, again, can be really slow. And you don't want to have to go after all of the content records to go get the libraries are associated to, and then go after all the content records again to go fetch different information and store it in a different table. That's not really the most efficient. So I'm going to pull on screen here another Power BI report, this guy right here. This one has already gone through the exercise of all of the recursion for you. It does all of the work. You can just piggyback on stuff that I've already done, and it has visible here all of the relevant tables. You can decide how much data it goes after, but this is all ready to go for you, so you don't have to write any of that in the Power BI space. Now, really, I want to show you a bit more about what this looks like. And so I'm going to pull forward the data transformation window because so far we've talked about going after and getting some data. And the steps over here, you can actually see exactly what I have done for my steps. And you can also dig a little bit deeper using the advanced editor for any of these tables inside of here, or any of the parameters that I've written, or any of the functions that I've also written that know how to do all of this recursion. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the logic so you understand what it does, so that you can use this in whatever other system it is you need to leverage. So first off, let's take and look at the content collection here in the first place. This is the exact same data we were looking at in that simple space, though this has already gone through and recursed through all of the information. So first off, I have a little parameter at the top of every one of my tables pretty much that tells me, that's not a good example, because those are subtables. Libraries, right? There's this scope here at the top of each of these. There's a collection inside of here, so it says from the CMS scope of data, go get me the library's collection of information, and it uses that to build me up sort of a URL that it can use to go fetch me the 8 libraries in my environment and presents them back to me. The rest of this is very much the same. It converts it to a table. It transposes that table. It does some header promotion inside of here. It changes some data types inside of here. And then from this, by the way, what this does specifically, if I tell the source, I have some parameters built into a little function there that says to build me up the actual URL. So this is building a URL for me from the scope, the collection, and then some other properties. This one right here is basically saying, get me the first page, get me 1 row of data, because it's super fast. And I'm doing this explicitly so that I can get how many total items are in here. It does the exact same thing for the contents over here. Instead of fetching 1,000 rows right away, what it does is it goes and fetches 1 item out of a list and figures out that there are 900 or 5,898 items that are available to it. And so then it changes the type to make it numbers, and then it invokes another custom function right here, which basically says, okay, now go get me all of those things. Go get me every single one of those page by page. So this is basically a page, and this is the list of all the items in each page. And it knows how to go through and basically fetch every single one of those for that scope, that collection, based on the total number of items that are here. So then it just recurses through and gets me all 5,800 rows. By the time I get down to the last data set here, if I was to scroll to the very bottom, this is only previewing the top 1,000 rows. Power BI likes to be efficient as well. But if I kept scrolling down and down and down and down and down, it would go get all of that data. So this is all that CMS information, CMS contents, the category field. It's everything from the CMS, and it's using the information that I learned from the Power BI environment to go get that CMS core data. Each of my collections are labeled inside of here, by the way. There's accounts data for your roles, your groups, your whatever. There's the CMS data, there's the PAL data, and there's also cloud shared licensing data. So all that information is in here already. But let's go take a look at what I'm doing for that recursion. How do I go get all of those individual items? Well, there's two things I had to have. First of all, I built up a little function here that's been written. If I go into the advanced editor here, it takes a couple of parameters. It takes the scope, which is, am I talking about the CMS or the cloud shared licensing or the PAL data or the accounts data? And then it goes after the collection, which is like for the CMS, is it contents? Is it searches? If it was accounts, it would be doing after things like users or groups, right? If there's an ID that's required, in this case, it's an optional field, but I can plug in an ID if I need to. I can plug in a page number where I need to. I can plug in how many rows I want back per page, which I have as a parameter up here, so I can change this whenever I need to. A start date and end date, which I have some baked in maths that tells it to do an automatic offset of 7 days. This is only fetching me 7 days of information. Or I can explicitly put in a start or end date if I want to. And then I can also force in additional switches if need be. And what this really does, when I fill this information out or pass it variables through one of these parameters or one of these other functions, it'll basically return at the very bottom a full URL. That's all it's doing, is returning me a string, a URL string. You can actually manually put values in here and click invoke. At the very bottom of your other queries, it'll actually give you back some of that information. But this is just simply building up the value for the collection, the URL ID, the request per page, right? It's just going to give you this and doing some logic inside of here to figure out, depending on what you're giving it, what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to structure that. Similarly up here, if we go and say, get me some data, this is the same, this get next X is the exact same thing as what I did in Postman, where I said, give me page 1 of 1,000 rows of this particular collection. If we take a look at it, this is much shorter. It says, here's all the variables that you've got. Some of these are optional, some of these are mandatory, but it goes in there and says, from the URL that you're going to write, it uses the get URL function down here, and it passes it all the parameters that it's going to need. And what it does then is it gets the source and returns back the items. That's it. It goes and fetches the items and returns it back to something else. Now, ultimately, that something else that calls this is the get all. That's what the contents down here is using. And this is where we get into recursion, because so far, everything I've been talking about, everything I've shown is all still the exact same thing. Go get this one thing and be done. Here, we're going to talk about recursing through. Once again, I have certain properties that I need, so I can pass those properties on through to other functions. This basically says, get the page count. How many pages are there? And so this is one of the fields is actually looking for a page count. It figures out what current page it's on. If it hasn't been assigned a current page, then it gives itself page 1. It just starts on page 1. Otherwise, if it has a page as it comes back around again, it sets the page number to +1. So it'll go through and get page 1, and then the next time it goes through, it uses page 2, and then page 3, and then page 4, and it just keeps incrementing that until it runs out of pages. Here it's figuring out how many total times it has to go through, or it's actually not going figuring that out. What it's doing is it's building up a total set of all of the results. The first thing it does is it says, first of all, if the previous results, if this has never been run before, then and the previous results is nothing, then what you're going to do is just first get the first collection of objects. So it runs get the next X, which is the first page that runs this guy. If previous results has something, then what it does is it runs, it will build the total results up of the previous results, and it also kind of combines together, it concatenates the next 1,000. So if I've run through this once, I've got 1,000 my previous results. The next result will get the next 1,000. I've now got 2, and then 3, and then 4, and it just keeps doing that until it runs out of results. And it figures that out by up here. It says, hey, what's the page count? How many total rows do I have? So it sets page count to the total rows divided by however many rows you're getting per page, divided by 1,000 right there. And then it says, okay, well, if your current page is less than the page count, then go get the next one. And it runs itself, get all X's. So it runs itself again to run through everything, passing through all the current values, including what the current page happens to be. And then it goes, oh yeah, great. Now I've got my next 1,000, my next 1,000, until my current page is not less than the page count. So when I've got page 7 and it's filled it out with the last page of data, then it just goes, okay, well, return back the total results and we're done. And then it jumps down here to the very end and outputs that back to the actual function. Every one of my different things, my libraries, my content, my searches, everything will use this exact same process to go figure out how many times it needs to run through, and it will go get all the results from those collections and give them back to me. That's it. That's what this get all X does. So that's how in my contents, in the major ones, the major tags, where is it at here? CMS tags, CMS searches, the save searches, each of these knows to go through and recurse through as many times as it needs to go fetch all that data and return everything back. It'll do it for PAL data. It'll do it for your cloud shared licensing every single session. It'll go fetch all of the data and return it all back. So that's all well and good. But now we need to do one more thing, because I've got the main records. What's the name of all my contents? When were they updated? But I don't have any of the file details. I've got none of the extra data about that. So if I wanted to know everything else about who favorited content, I have to store that in a different table for efficiency purposes and retrieval efficiencies. If I want to know what libraries individual pieces of content are associated to, or what models things were loaded into, or when there was revisions, I have to go through and get that detailed information and recurse through it. And so that works a little bit differently. One of the things I was talking about was leveraging a master table, and this is really important in Power BI for speed of fetching and refreshing your data. If you don't use a master table in Power BI for this nested bit of data, you are going to be spending a very long time waiting for Power BI to refresh, because Power BI is a terrible data storage solution. So what I do for that is I have these little master raw tables set up inside of here. You'll see these scattered throughout. What these do is that initial fetch and recursion through every single piece of content ID. And then all of these other tables are just a copy of this table. They actually reference it for their data, and then they expand out what they want to expand out. That way they're referencing something that's already cached in Power BI and doesn't have to go fetch, all of this information, what is this, 10 times for the same exact piece of content. That would be really slow. So this table here is the next major one. Inside of here, I'm telling it some parameters again. I'm telling it, in this case, what to include. So I have some switches here baked into this environment. There may be certain things you don't want to go after. Maybe you don't want to include the files, or maybe you don't want to include the loads or the documents that it's been loaded into, or reviews or revisions. Maybe you don't care about some of this stuff. Totally great. There is a collection of switches up here in my parameters. They're basically true falses. And all you have to do is edit these values and say, if you don't want it to go after something, you set it to false. So like my include files right here is false. It's not getting and fetching each individual file. It's not getting and fetching each individual parameter and value and whatnot. Down here, there's attachments and downloads. I'm not going and getting those either. I am getting the loads. I do care about that. Maybe I am getting, the document records. Maybe I do care about that, but there's certain information I'm not going after. And so some of my reporting data may be empty because of it, but that's okay. It is going after a bunch of information here, but it uses these true false triggers here inside the query itself. And I did this in a table, so it was easier to view it all instead of having just 1,000 different parameters up here. I made that includes table to make that just a bit easier. So this is basically getting whether or not it's supposed to include certain things. And then it goes here and says, all right, well, if it's told to go get content details, then build up a specific thing. Otherwise, if it's told not to get content details at all, it just builds a fake manual single record that's nothing, and it dumps it in so it doesn't error out on you. But if it does go get the actual content details, it basically does the same thing it's always done. It goes and gets the source data. It removes whatever columns it doesn't need, which is specific pieces of information, and then it renames a specific column to ID. And then it uses that ID column. It only keeps this content ID value here because that's all it needs for this next step. It invokes the custom function of getting each individual item by ID. And it just recurses through in here and goes and fetches each thing. And in fact, Power BI is pretty cool because it does this step automatically by itself, but it'll recurse through. And again, it knows whether it's supposed to include specific things in the subquery here for this particular thing. And then it leaves it all rolled up. It doesn't expand anything out at all, but it has all of the data cached in this one big data collection. So this is the recursion here. Just go invoke the custom function. For each row, it goes through and gets the X data by the ID, and it knows what all the properties are supposed to be for it. Fills out its information. Then what I do is I unroll that. So let's say we take a look at content loads. Where was this content used? If I take a look at this, it'll tell me it's using the raw table, the CMS content raw table up here, references already cached data. It removes all the trash it doesn't care about for this, and then it expands out the content loads major header and keeps specific fields for it, unzips the data and names everything. So now on here, I have all my content load data ready to go. If it's never been loaded, it'll all be nulls for that row. If it has been loaded, it tells you what document it was loaded into. So this way you can actually query and figure out where all of your families or content has ever been used, right? But this is already all unzipped for you. You can just kind of start from this. But it uses that basic kind of recursion concept here. Build me a URL, get a bit of data from the main collection, recurse through and get all the data, and then after I've gotten all the data, take that ID column from whatever that collection is and get each of those IDs subsets of data and store that someplace. Right? That's how you get all that information. It works the same for accounts. It works the same for the CMS data. It works the same for the cloud shared licensing, and it works the same for the PAL documentation. All of it is the same. Okay, final concepts here. This is a lot of information I know to ingest or to digest. We're going to talk about the final concepts here, and this is all just going to be talk. I'm not going to, demonstrate a lot of this because we're going to probably do a webinar about this particular topic in the future. Specifically, especially if you have interest in that. Okay, so how do we do custom extraction, translation, and loading of data into other data sets? So how do we do this? So what is the exact ETL workflow? That's the shortcut for this extract, translate, load workflow. What is this workflow? Well, what you're going to do first is extract all the data. We're going to go through and pull everything down to something. As you extract it for each major thing, we're going to be translating that data. This is everything. This is exactly the same thing we just did in Power BI. We translated certain stuff. We stored it in certain ways. We extracted certain kinds of data, and then we effectively loaded into a data storage scenario, which for us today so far has all been Microsoft Power BI. But that data storage can be anything. An example would be if I went to my local computer here. I'm going to pull this on screen here in just a moment. I have this temp folder, and just yesterday I ran the Python script that I have inside the repository that you can fork, that GitHub repository. I ran that, and I went and got all of this data for the past, I think it was 30 days of information. And so it went through and it pulled down the data as individual .json files, fully filled out for every user, for every piece of content inside of here. This has thousands and thousands, well, 6,836 rows worth of data right there. It went and got all my libraries, all my saved searches, and then it went inside of here and it looked at each of those content IDs and it recursed through and it pulled down each content by ID and gave me every piece of data for that particular piece of content ready to go so I could see that information. That's an extraction of data and a loading into JSON individual files. That's what that is. That's the extract and load. There was no translation. It just pulls the data down and dumps it into a folder structure here on my system, and I can use that however I'd like. However, a far more efficient way to store this is in some kind of a database. In my case, one of the things that I'm doing right now is developing out the storage automatically into a Microsoft SQL server. or you could point it to any data store you want. If you want PostgreSQL, if you wanted MySQL, if you wanted, I don't know, Azure SQL, if you wanted to go to Domo, it doesn't matter. Whatever database you want this to go into, it can go there. And then ultimately what you'd want to effectively do is take your Power BI file, and instead of pointing to the web API, which it has to do all the extraction, all the translation, and the loading into its own data set, and then display the data, instead of doing all of that, you would extract, translate, and load the data into a server, a database environment, and then you'd point the BI file, whatever your BI tool is, to that database, whatever it is. And by doing that, it makes the BI tools run way faster. It makes your data refresh run way faster as well. Because some of the things that you can do with this is you can control exactly how that database updates. Instead of needing to go fetch everything, this folder structure here, yesterday when I went and fetched this, it took 37 minutes to go fetch all of my data and store all of it for the past 30 days locally for everything in my company. 30 minutes. 30 minutes isn't bad, but if I was waiting for Power BI to do that and fetch all of that data, in fact, I did a full refresh earlier today. Power BI took about 15 minutes to fully refresh everything from the past, well, in my case, it was 7 days. And I think it was actually a little less than 15 minutes because I walked away and came back 15 minutes later. But it's instead of me waiting for that when I want that refresh, what I can do is I can write a little routine in, say, Python and tell it to only fetch the latest main records, the contents, main records, the library's main records. And then I can look at what I've already got stored, and I can compare the updated times from the database and see when it was last updated there, comparing that to my latest fetch. And if something is new, then I go fetch the extra details. And when I go fetch those extra details, instead of it taking 30 to 45 minutes for my tiny company, or for some of you who have really big companies with a lot of data, it may take an hour and a half to go fetch all the data normally. But if you're only fetching new items or updated items, it's going to take less than 5 minutes, and then you cache that data in your database. It's much more efficient processing-wise, time-wise. And then you can actually have this, again, run on a schedule. Maybe you refresh it every night. Maybe you refresh it every hour. And then when you want to go take a look at a report in Microsoft Power BI, you simply refresh from your local data storage, and it's way faster. Or if you're caching that data in a tool system that's much more powerful like Domo, well, then Domo can automatically refresh every night or every hour or whatever you want, and your reports are simply just automatically going to be up to date. So there's a lot of power that you have here. The repository that I've already kind of put up, just so you know, we talked today about the API Essentials Postman setup files today. We talked about the Power BI file in detail today. You can get this, so you can just plug in your web API key and tell this to refresh, and it'll go fetch all of your data, no effort really, but it's not the most efficient way to do this. If you want to go a bit more advanced and tied into other systems, well, I have rewritten all of those functions in the Power BI file right here in Python so that it does all the exact same things. It knows exactly how to go fetch the individual switches. It knows how to build the URL. It knows how to go in there and get each individual thing by the ID. It knows how to get the total number of items. All the stuff that we talked about in Power BI today translated into Python code. So you can actually use this particular little collection, this little library of functions, which I did down here in my JSON collection, and I've told it to use this to recursively build me individual JSON files. Right now, if you were to go run this main Python file here, which has a whole bunch of commented out junk, but basically what it does is it says, go fetch all the base JSON files. This is the only thing that needs to run, and it goes and grabs this file here, the JSON function right here, and it goes and runs all this code, which also fetches this code here. Now, for it to know where to go, again, there's options here. You have to know where to go. In each of these different collections, there's different settings specific to them. Right here, this has sort of my CTC Express Tools API key in my environment. When you go fork this, it's going to say, put your API key here. When you put your API key there and you run it, then it'll go fetch for 30 days all the records that it's supposed to fetch. and dump it to a JSON file. Or you can translate that into, like I've got a SQL connection down here that's just beginning. It's not really flushed out yet, so you probably don't really want to use this. But you could write this SQL connection to go wherever you want it to go, or you could take the Python code and use it however you want to use it. The whole goal here is to give you a starting point, to get you kicked off, to be able to leverage the API data from CTC. Okay. With that, once again, I'm going to thank you all. Glad you stuck with me to the end here today. I know it was a lot of information. These reporting style and kind of analytic style webinars tend to take a lot longer because it's a deeper concept and takes a lot more background information that most of us don't just inherently have from our daily jobs. So once again, thank you all for sticking around to the end. And if you have any follow-up questions for me, I encourage you to reach out. Certainly you can get a hold of us at techsupport@ctcsoftware.com, or you can hit us up in other channels if you have other channels available to you to get a hold of us and ask us additional questions. We look forward to seeing you in the next CTC webinar. And certainly when you exit out of this one, if there's certain things you'd like me to talk more about on this topic in the feedback that pops up, let us know. If you're like, yeah, man, I really want to know more about the Python coding, or I really want to know more about how to work with Power BI, like, let us know what you want, because that's how we know what webinars to focus on for you. So thank you all. Have a fantastic day.